Hitting this massive chunk of ice, it was a hair-raising moment to say the least, and I'll tell you all about it. For years, I thought about cruising to Alaska, but life and a certain pandemic, they got in the way. So it wasn't until last summer that I finally had the opportunity. And once I did, I realized what I had been missing. Put simply, it's by far the most memorable cruise I have ever taken, and not just because you don't forget the feeling of a ship shuddering when it hits a block of ice. You're about to see why I found it so mind-blowing. For this trip, I departed Seattle on a 7-day cruise up to Alaska. Now, one thing that had always kept me from sailing there was the cost. Frankly, you'll spend way more money here than to go to the Caribbean. But one silver lining about the pause in cruising is that I had some credit and bonus for my cancellation that made the price much more bearable. So I left in May, sailing aboard Royal Caribbean's Quantum of the Seas, headed to 4 different ports: Sitka, Skagway, Juneau, and then Victoria, British Columbia, before returning home to Seattle. And for this trip, I booked a balcony cabin, but to save some cash, I booked the obstructed view balcony. Yeah, maybe not my smartest move, but more on that in a second. Now, I thought I'd be clever and show up late to board on embarkation day. Normally, if you show up at the end of the boarding window, people have already boarded and you breeze through the terminal. So after flying in and taking an Uber over to Pier 91, I showed up around 2:30 in the afternoon. And I'm greeted to literally hundreds of people who aren't even able to get into the building because the line was so long. In total, I'd say it took about an hour from the time I arrived at the port until I was finally on the ship. Definitely not a fun way to start a trip. The first thing I did was head to my cabin to see where I'd be spending the week. As you may know, Quantum of the Seas, it's a fairly new ship. It was built in 2014. So the room, I thought it was nicely appointed and updated. And then it was time to check out that obstructed view. Yes, they were not kidding in this case. The top half of my view was fantastic, but the bottom half, well, I can tell you that this lifeboat, it was built in Germany. It's 52 feet long and it holds 307 passengers in an emergency. Not that I had the chance to study every detail or anything. As for the rest of the ship, there are a couple of things that I noticed during the cruise. First, Quantum of the Seas itself turned out to be ideal for cruising Alaska. As part of the Quantum class, this ship is new and modern. So just overall, it had a nice updated feeling. It was also large with a lot of amenities and things to do. They had everything from the flow rider to the North Star observation pod to ripcord where you can simulate skydiving while in the middle of the ocean. But the design of the ship is what really made it great for Alaska. There are lots of spots that are indoors, and for when the weather turns bad, you can still use them. On the back of the ship, there's the Seaplex that's enclosed and has everything from bumper cars to basketball to pickleball and laser tag throughout the day. Forward, there's the solarium that's enclosed in glass, offering a spot to hang out and watch the scenery without freezing your tail off. And there was even an indoor covered pool that was also heated like the rest of the pools on the ship, giving you an option to swim no matter how cold it might be outside. But what really stood out to me was that the atmosphere on the ship, it was completely different than when you're sailing the Caribbean. Head on a cruise from Miami and there's music playing, there's drinks flowing, people are dancing, and there's always that big sail away party. Things are much more subdued on an Alaskan cruise, I found out. There's no tropical music playing by the pool. And instead of towels, there are blankets set out on the pool loungers. And sailing away, it wasn't a big party, but a chance to get some great views of Seattle as we started our trip and headed for Alaska. Now, the first day at sea, it was a bit of a rude awakening. The weather in Seattle, it was great, but as we headed north along the coast of Canada, it was gray, overcast, and about 45 degrees and windy. Just miserable and definitely not what you get in the Caribbean. Thankfully, as I said, the ship, it had a lot going on inside. Between the solarium, the indoor pool, and the Seaplex, there was a lot to explore and do, especially given that this was the first day at sea and you're still getting used to the ship. But this cruise had the absolute best luck with weather. Any day that we were at sea, the weather was bad. That included going up to Alaska and when sailing back home. But anytime that we were actually in port, it was drop dead gorgeous. Case in point, after a day at sea, we woke up to great weather as the ship hit the first port of call, Sitka, Alaska. Now, outside of cruising, I had never heard anything about Sitka, but come to find out, it has a ton of history. The Tlingit people here are indigenous, and when Alaska was part of Russia, there became a big Russian influence as well. But it was also this town in 1867 where the ceremony transferring control of Alaska from Russia to the United States was held. So yeah, it's a bit different than making a stop in COZUMEL and hitting up Margaritaville. Today, Sitka is a small community with less than 10,000 people. It's walkable, and there's a shuttle from the cruise port to the actual town located about 5 miles away. I spent the day doing a few things. First, I just explored the town. The center of the city is closed off to traffic, so you can just walk from spot to spot. There's a lot of shops and restaurants, and all around you is a ring of gorgeous mountains. Now as I'm walking, I look down an alley and I see stone stairs going up the side of a hill. So I climb up without any idea where they're headed, and it's a plateau that overlooks the Sound, a dormant volcano, and the town itself. I mean, just stunning views. Then I start to read the signs that are located around the perimeter of the plateau. Turns out that I stumbled upon a spot called Baranof Castle. This is the actual spot where the power of Alaska was transferred over to the United States from Russia, just 2 years after the Civil War. In other words, it's arguably one of the most important spots in Alaskan history. After taking in the view, I headed back down to look for some lunch, where I picked up some halibut ceviche from a food cart. Didn't look very good, but it tasted fantastic. And while I walked about 10 minutes across town to Sitka National Historical Park, made a great snack. I'm a fan of anything run by our national park system, and this spot is an absolute gem. It features walking trails through the forest, which isn't that unusual, but it also has tons of totem poles from the native people here. These days, the originals are either lost to the elements or they are on display in the visitor center. But replicas of these works of art are on display throughout the trail system, with some of them reaching 30 feet tall or more. It's an easy walk, and being in the forest, but also right next to the water, is a great way to see some of the natural beauty that Alaska has to offer. So if you can't tell, I thought Sitka was a cool spot, but the next port, Skagway, is a place that I'll never forget. Back on the ship, we sailed through the night, and it's the first time that I really noticed just how wild being this far north is. We left port around 6 p.m. and it was still bright out. You go to dinner, you do some stuff around the ship like watch a show. Next thing you know, it's 10 o'clock at night and it's still light out. So I'd close the curtain in my room, try to get a little sleep, only to wake up around 4:30 or 5 a.m. because I'm still on a different time zone and it's already bright out again. So I guess I'm up for the day. So while Sitka is a bit of a real town, Skagway these days is much more focused on tourism. It sits right at the water's edge of a valley between two mountains, and the location means just some jaw-dropping scenery. The spot served as a starting point for trips into the Yukon during the gold rush. Today, it really revolves around tourism and playing up that gold rush history. But in the spring and summer, it's also unbelievably gorgeous. Getting off the ship, you're met with this huge rock face that you dock by. And what I thought was pretty cool is that crew from other ships, they paint a memento of their visit. There are paintings dating back literally decades from other ships, and some of them are way up there to where I don't know how on earth they managed to paint them. The big draw in Skagway actually seems to be the White Pass Railroad, a train ride. It takes you up through the pass that miners used to go on foot on their way to hunt for gold. Today, it's a much easier trek. It has some amazing views. As for me, I opted to just explore town for a bit, stopping at the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park to see exactly how the heck that this town came to be, given that it is so remote. I also mailed a couple of postcards to family from the post office that's located in Skagway, which I thought would be a neat souvenir for the folks back home. And in case you're wondering, it took about 2 weeks for the postcards to arrive. And then I just started to walk north. Skagway is the farthest north on the planet that I've ever been, and frankly, I don't know when I'll have the chance to visit again. So when I realized that with literally every step north, I was essentially setting a new personal record in my travels, I just kept walking and exploring. Out of the touristy spots and into the real part of town, I finally reached this creek that just seemed like a natural place to make the turn back south. Heading back into town, I stopped in a few shops before the smell of donuts caught my attention. Now, I'm a fan of anything sweet, and a store selling something called a Klondike Doughboy, yeah, that definitely calls my name. With a line out the door, it had to be good. So for $7, they serve a dinner-sized fried piece of deliciousness coated in cinnamon sugar. It's essentially a funnel cake, and it will serve 4 adults easily. I was able to eat only about half of it, at which point I could literally feel my heart racing from the sugar as I headed back to the ship. But the next morning, something else would get my heart racing just as much. That next morning was sailing the Endicott Arm and seeing Dawes Glacier. Here, it's an inlet where the mountain walls, they just continually get closer as you sail through the water that's essentially like glass. It's a spectacular experience, and as we sail farther in, we start to see little chunks of ice, and then they get bigger. Then there's a big chunk, and we seem headed right for it. All of a sudden, you feel the vibration on the ship and hear the sound of ice against steel. Just in time, I turn my camera to get a shot of the ice as it passes to the side. I mean, compare this chunk of ice to the person on the deck, and you get a sense of the size. Now, I'm not someone to unnecessarily freak out, but it even had me asking, is this supposed to happen? Thankfully, however, I guess it turned out to be no big deal. While a lot of us passengers were wide-eyed, we just continued on our way, first having to do a turn back from the glacier due to still being too much ice in the water before making our stop that afternoon in Juneau. Now in Juneau, I had an excursion planned to go gold panning. I was really hoping that we get a chance to dig on our own and pan, similar to what I've done in Georgia. But here, the pay dirt was already set in the pans, and our tour guide just showed us how to work the dirt to finish with the gold. But while I was excited about the panning at first and kind of turned out to be a little bit of a dud, what really turned out to be the best part was the scenery. Our spot was right next to a river surrounded by mountains. As for gold, yeah, I found a little to take home with me, but I could have just spent all day by the river, to be honest. After panning, we still had plenty of time in port after being dropped off at the ship, so I went out exploring. Now, near the cruise ports is the Alaskan Capitol building, and it's wide open to visitors. I walked in, I said hi to the security guard just to make sure that I was okay to wander around, and they just suggested that I start at the top of the building and work my way down. So there I am, completely alone with hardly anybody else in the seat of the Alaskan government. I'm checking out the chambers and the governor's office and just giving myself my own tour like I was visiting my old high school or something. Before I headed back to the ship, I stopped by an awesome outdoor brewery that's right near the docks for a couple of fantastic fish tacos and watched as float planes took off and landed on the water. Yeah, Alaska is a pretty cool place. The last port of call is one that I think many people don't really focus on. I know I personally didn't, and that was a mistake. Victoria is the capital of British Columbia, and it's essentially a requirement for cruise ships to stop here to comply with US laws since they are technically foreign vessels. Since there wasn't a ton of time in port, I just booked a simple bus tour that let us hit all the highlights. I was personally amazed by the city. It's just stunning. The flowers were in bloom everywhere. Everything was that bright green that comes with spring. And the city itself, it just seemed very livable with lots of parks and green space. And then there's the architecture, in particular, the area around the harbor with the British Columbia Assembly Building. It's just drop dead gorgeous. You can't miss it. I personally only had a few hours here, but I could have spent days taking in the city. It's definitely an underrated stop when headed to Alaska. With that, however, it was time to head back to Seattle, and the cruise to Alaska was done, seemingly right after it got started. So just a few quick final thoughts on this cruise. I am not blowing smoke when I say that of all the cruises I've taken, sailing Alaska comes out head and shoulders above them all. The ports that you visit, they are just insanely beautiful, and I love that they are real cities, not just kitschy spots built for tourists. And then there's the natural scenery. It's second to none up here, and there's no better way to experience it than by cruise ship. So if you have a trip to Alaska booked, then frankly, I am jealous of you. If you're considering it, I can say that you will not regret it. Have questions about sailing Alaska? Let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them based on my experience. Until next time, happy sailing.